Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Rising Laterally podcast. This is Arjun Sachdev.
And this is Jay Ballou. We hope you find something here that offers you new meaning or a fresh perspective.
If you do, we encourage you to give it life.
Be bold.
Experiment.
And most importantly, bring it into the interactions with the people you surround yourself with.
And see what happens.
Welcome to the Rising Laterally podcast. Today we wanted to give a State of the Union on the housing market. We're going to be talking about some dynamics you may already be familiar with: lower mortgage rates, supply and demand, patterns in millennial home buying. But we're also going to get into some of the more novel ways the pandemic has shaped housing, fertility, and migration. Arjun, what have you noticed in terms of the new necessities in the housing market?
Well, I will say that the research pointed me to something interesting, which is that, the housing market has never had to navigate a worldwide pandemic. So,
True.
Right? That's one thing. But no, all joking aside, basically what you find is that this entire period, the pandemic, the quarantine, and now a lot of people are thinking about the value of their home. What's important to them? What are they looking for? What is a fully functioning house actually look like in the future? And while, people have thought about moving, before the pandemic, now when you think about moving, if you're looking at a new construction, you kind of have to have a bunch of boxes filled, right? You're looking for more space. You might be looking for that extra bedroom that converts into your flex study room, or the room where your kid can, do online education, if that's part of the curriculum for schools. So, the bottom line is that, if you were going from a 2-bedroom to a 3-bedroom, you may now be going from a 2-bedroom to a 4-bedroom. And on top of that, you may be looking for extra space in your backyard. So the thing is that this pandemic, this quarantine, again, reinforced what a family values. And since they couldn't even leave, now families are looking for having just simply more space. And that actually is what's creating a lot of competition.
Yeah, interesting. So going into the kind of high level state of the housing market, as you mentioned, there is a lot of competition. There is pretty limited supply, which has driven market prices up. It's definitely a seller's market right now. I can read some statistics here. March actually marked the largest 1-month increase ever recorded in the more than 25-year history of the Zillow Home Value Index. So that was surpassing even the housing run-up that preceded the Great Recession. And there was a 10.6% rise from March 2020 to the following year, which was the largest annual increase in 15 years. So year over year, housing prices have increased at an exceptional rate. And as you mentioned, the reason why we're seeing such a run up is that there's this massive squeeze on supply. We're actually looking at a home vacancy rate of just 0.9% right now. So there are a lot of people looking to make a move, looking to move into a bigger space to find something that's more accommodative to their new work from home conditions. And there just aren't that many houses on the market right now. And we're really seeing the inflation in housing prices and the demand for housing prices across the board. I thought it was going to be limited to exceptionally high demand areas like Austin or Boise or Tampa Bay, but really like the demand has been elevated across the board. I'll share one more statistic with you. In 27 of the nation's 50 largest metro areas, a majority of homes went under contract in less than a week in April. So these houses are flying off the market. And in Columbus, Denver, and Salt Lake City, a week was all it took for more than 70% of local listings to go pending. And the share of homes going pending in less than 2 weeks was higher year over year in April in every single top 50 metro area in the country except Memphis. So really across the board, supply is squeezed, houses are going pending incredibly fast, and it's a seller's market.
Agreed. And adding to that, if you look at new purchases, new construction purchases specifically, they surged nearly 19% in 2020, which was the biggest increase since before the financial meltdown of 2008. So that's just to add a little more meat to what you were saying. And then in terms of, listings and things like that, I pulled up some information from California data. So this is for information ending the week of May 29th. There were 950 closed sales per day that week. There were 996 pending sales per day that week. And there was 879 new listings per day that week, which
Wow.
actually is a 12% reduction from the prior week. So you talk
Wow.
about, the activity that's taking place. It's remarkable. On top of that, realtors, in terms of what they experienced, 26% closed a sale in that week.
Mm.
32% of houses went into escrow. And so my point is that when you look at these numbers, it's like there's a lot that's going on. It's a very active market. Real estate agents are, having to contend with it. Before we get there, though, you had mentioned a couple of cities like Salt Lake. And that reminds me of something that I came across, which was the bidding wars that are taking
Mm.
place. And the fact that about 40% of potential buyers cited in a new survey by the National Association of Home Builders that they went through a bidding war. The competition is fierce across the nation. You were alluding to that. But if you look at some information by Redfin, 90% of the people that tried to buy a house in Salt Lake City faced competition. It was the number one tightest market in terms of like strict competition, followed by San Diego, the Bay Area, Denver, and Seattle. So again, just there's not a lot of inventory. You have low mortgage rates. People feel like they can make a monthly payment right now on a higher priced home, and
Yeah.
that's just leading to this frenzy, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had mentioned that there's lower inventory. I didn't realize that that goes all the way back to the 2008 era. So, as we all know, there was a big housing bust in '08. A lot of bad loans. Some people were buying houses that couldn't afford them. There was reckless lending on the part of the banks. People were unable to pay those mortgages. They were foreclosed on, and then that flooded the market with an excess supply of homes. And boom, the whole thing comes down. And the people that were hurt along with the home purchasers were also the builders. So the home building activity went through a major collapse following '08 because if there are already millions of empty houses out there on the market that were foreclosed on, it doesn't really make sense to build more. And you rewind to before the crisis, just to put some numbers on it, in the early mid 2000s, builders were putting out a minimum of 1.6 million housing starts a month. But it wasn't until a decade after '08, so like 2018, that we got back to that 1.6 million housing starts a month level. So that was like a
Yeah.
decade that it took builders to get back to pre-recession levels. And as I mentioned earlier, the result of that dearth of building was a 0.9% homeowner vacancy rate in Q1 2021. And now we're starting to see builders come back into the fold here. Builder confidence is actually back at all-time highs. So I think as time goes on, it will become less of a seller's market. The supply and demand will come into greater balance. We haven't really talked about the demand piece of it. We can talk about that more in a moment here. But it seems that there will be more listings coming onto the market in the coming years.
Interesting you say that because in terms of what realtors think, 52% think listings will be up next week, which is actually an increase in terms of the prior week as well. So
Mm.
there will be more listings. I think that's what you just mentioned at the end of your comments there, which
Yep.
is interesting in terms of data that I found. But you know what's a big difference between now and the 2008 era is there are more qualified purchasers.
Mm.
Like there's a more stringent, you know, uh, um, screening process that you have to
Yep.
go through, right? Because obviously banks learn from their mistakes. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think about real estate agents right now. I think about the fact that, in such a frenzy, a lot of them have had to switch up how they do their business.
Mm.
If you can't meet somebody or you have to keep social distancing, all of a sudden you're now doing remote showings.
Yeah.
You're now doing live virtual open houses, or maybe you're doing ones where you record yourself going around and then you just put it on your website. So that's like a static version of an open house. But imagine being a real estate agent you've been in doing it for 15 years. You relied on your personality and the human to human interactions
Mhm.
that took place throughout the walkthrough or throughout the open house. And now you're forced to figure out, like, how do I become comfortable in front of cameras? How do I use the technology? How do I make sure that I can understand the body language through a camera? So I think about people like that right now in terms of how COVID specifically has impacted the real estate market.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. They're definitely going through the same evolution in terms of figuring out how to command a digital presence. And I have a statistic here actually around the rise of virtual tours. Nearly 60% of millennials say they would be at least somewhat comfortable making an offer on a home without touring in person. We've actually seen the adoption of purchases, buying homes sight unseen increase this past year, which is unsurprising. And along with that figure
Yeah.
that I just cited, almost 40% of millennials say they would be comfortable buying a home online. And I think back to my own childhood. I was born in California. We moved to the East Coast, where I spent most of my childhood when I was around 5. My dad ended up getting a job in Boston, and I remember all the way back then, 25 years ago now. Before we moved, my parents took like a week-long trip out there, just the two of them, to figure out where we were going to live. They were like scouting out different towns, looking at the houses, driving by the schools, the parks. They were walking the town centers. And I imagine they hit maybe 3 or 4 towns in this week-long trip that they were
Right.
packing a lot into. And I just imagine if we get to a point where there are virtual housing tours and also like virtual town tours, so you can see a whole town, and select that town for your family sight unseen. If you could imagine sitting down at your computer, let's say you're moved to the Dallas area, you can see maybe like 100 houses or 40 towns in full in 10 hours time. And there's just so many implications there in terms of the efficiency and in terms of like the increased competition between the towns to attract residents. So I think the
Mm,
implications of people moving and buying houses sight unseen is just massive, because the amount of houses that they'll be able to prospect could increase by an order of magnitude.
agreed. And so it's here to stay. Those
Mhm.
remote showings are here to stay. And as you said, I mean, it's going to be adopted by the next wave of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, personally, do you think you could ever buy a house sight unseen? I was asking myself that question.
I think it depends on, actually, it really just depends on like if you're renting or buying. For
Hmm.
me personally, the way I'm thinking about it right now, and this could be a narrow-minded way of thinking about it, is if I was renting the place, I'd have less of a concern of just doing it remotely and just pressing buy online.
Hmm.
But in terms of purchasing a home, you, from my experience, it helps to be able to see it, touch the walls, meet the owner, get a little history, see the neighborhood in person. Because again, you're putting a huge upfront payment in terms of your down payment. You're making a 15 or 30-year commitment to this one piece of property.
Hmm.
So for that alone, I think I would want to stay with the live in person interactions. But if I was just going from one renting or one apartment to another apartment, I would just do it online.
Yeah. Yeah, and you had mentioned there that buying a house is a massive investment of money for many people around our age, millennials that are buying homes. It's by far the biggest purchase they've made in their life to date, and probably will ever make over the course of their life. I wanted to get in a little bit into the demand side of things. Who's buying homes right now? We've seen about half of all new mortgage originations this past year come from millennials, and millennials at this point are aged 24 to 39. So, among those who have been able to afford houses, a lot of them have been taking advantage of historically low mortgage rates this past year to do so. I think it's also worth pointing out just how massive the millennial generation is. As of 2019, there was 72 million of us. And as Zillow writes about this, many of us are approaching our 40s. We're aging into our prime career building, family starting, home buying years. And the combined number of millennials turning 34 over this next decade, which is the median age of first home buyers, is roughly 46 million. So there's a lot of millennials right now coming into that sweet spot. And I think the question really is whether there will be sustained demand for houses on the part of millennials. Maybe for 50 years ago, when baby boomers were buying houses, it would be reasonable to expect that many in those generation would continue to buy houses and keep demand strong. But we're in a very different, much more precarious economic situation, at least most of us across the millennial generation. So my question, the thing that I've been really thinking about as I've been reading up on the market this week, is how many more millennials out there will be buying homes, and did the sliver of millennials that had the money to buy homes already make that purchase this past year? Are there really millions of millennials waiting in the wings, ready to make that home purchase? And I think, we can go into the statistics, but I think at this point, like many things, it's an uncertainty.
That's interesting. I could see how you would see like the first wave of millennials going through this process and leaving some people behind. But when you look at demographic shifts, we are seeing, especially here in the United States, we're seeing a more pronounced aging population, and we're seeing more millennials be ethnically diverse. So we're actually seeing a decline in the size of the white population.
Mm.
And the reason I'm saying that is because I think that you will continue to see waves of millennials that will buy up property. And I will also say that if you look at new construction projects, if you're driving down the interstate, a lot of them are advertising in a way that's appealing to millennials. Going back to the original point of having extra space or a backyard, there's ads now where they'll be advertising for the new complex that's being developed, and they'll show people sitting at their desk at the laptop, and it'll basically be saying like, do you have flex space?
Yeah.
Like, you have a millennial in there. It's targeted for millennials. And so I think for that reason, you'll continue to see demand.
Interesting. And specifically for houses with more bedrooms, with bigger backyards, that kind of thing, in your mind?
My opinion, which is interesting because it's like, at what point does that switch? At what point do you feel like you have too big of a house? Maybe like 10 years from now, when things, I actually don't even know if I want to speculate on what's going to happen 10 years from now. Let's just
Yeah.
say for now, people are thinking like, let's just make my home my sanctuary
Yeah.
and just make sure everything that I need is there. So that's
Yeah.
what I'm seeing.
Yeah. And I did come across a statistic that there were actually, if the work from home trend continues, there would be 2 million more millennials that could afford that first home, were they able to move from these expensive metropolitan areas where there is work to lower cost suburbs. So it's just fascinating, the decisions on the parts of these business leaders as to whether they bring their employees back, that could inform whether up to 2 million millennials end up buying homes or not. It's really interesting.
It's very interesting. And I mean, just what I've noticed, I can't imagine companies are forcing their employees to come back 5 days a week. From what I've been reading, those companies are seeing a lot of people just leave. Like,
Hmm.
workers don't want to go back to the office. And it's funny because it's like, if you're being told you're going to have to be back for 5 days, you might be at home right now trying to figure out where your next job's going to be at a company that doesn't have an office first mentality. Again, I think that's completely switched. I think a lot of companies have gone remote first, and there
Hmm.
might be like a 2 or 3 day window where you come into the office, maybe to meet the people. I can imagine how it's useful if you want to get like instructions from the top down. And then once you have your marching orders, you can just do that from home.
Hmm.
But as a company, if you don't want to see your workers leave, like, you cannot be saying that you're going to be in the office 5 days a week.
Yeah, I do not think that there's the appetite to return to things exactly as they were.
I was going to say that then you don't need the big offices. So we're going to
Mm.
continue to see a shift in just the design of cities. I mean, and quickly on design of cities, it's happening already where there's fewer cars So if we're talking about like COVID's impact on things, I mean, like I know we were talking about the housing market specifically, but we've gotten to this point in the conversation where it's even impacting the amount of cars that are in cities. And I just can't imagine a world where it goes back to where the sidewalks for that are in front of restaurants are no longer used by the restaurants. Like that, I think is a shift we're going to see moving forward. And cities want their citizens to like be riding bikes and taking mass transit so that they can be more eco-friendly. So there's a lot of layers to this that are already playing out around the world.
Yeah, I think a lot of them are for the better. I've been spending time. I live down in Redwood City now, but I've been spending time up in San Francisco on the weekends, particularly in the Marina area, and the outdoor seating is beautiful. And the city has found a way to provide parking for people that need it, even with those parking spaces supplanted with seating space. And I think it is a beautiful evolution for the city. I think it really contributes to the overall ambiance of some of these neighborhoods. And as you mentioned, I think there will be a lot of those COVID adaptations that we find were actually good things, and there's something that we should hold on to.
Exactly.
And I think they're going back to the housing market and the legacy of the pandemic and, what millennials want going forward. I think that there's this idea circulating among some of the older generations that millennials prefer flexibility in work, in lifestyle, and housing. Like we avoid uncertainty. There's certainly some truth to that. Our generation has lived through a number of extremely disconcerting times with 9/11, with '08, with Trump's presidency, with the pandemic. And I think there's maybe a tendency on the part of some of the older generations to think that we don't want homes. But the reality is that millennials do want homes. And the issue is actually affordability more than anything else. 72% of millennials said they could not afford a home, and 32% of them are avoiding purchasing a home because of the cost of home maintenance. Another statistic there, 63% of millennials have no down payment saved, so $0. And the factors that are contributing to this are the ones we're already all familiar with: stagnating income growth, increased student loan debt, and I think maybe millennials will start to save as some of those millennials in like the 24 to 30 range age into their mid to late 30s. But I think I think the issue here is not that millennials want to be these like free spirited transients their whole life. I think they do want homes. The issue is just affordability.
I have an interesting angle on that, which is because of '08, a lot of millennials learned how to save.
Mm, mm,
I do feel bad for the millennials who lost their job in COVID during COVID, like a lot of the restaurant workers, and the fact that they don't want to go back to being a restaurant worker
hmm
because, it's just not paying enough. I
hmm
can understand that. But at the same time, a millennial that experienced 2008 or saw their parent like struggle because of '08, for those, they may have actually realized the importance of, having that 401k set up or having the IRA set up to have funds for emergency situations. So while like the statistics are out there that, people wouldn't be able to even afford like a $400 emergency
hmm
cost, which is just sad and shocking.
Yeah.
I believe there's a cohort of millennials that learned from 2008 and said, okay, this stuff can happen. I need to have savings. So, I mean, just one person's perspective.
I think you're absolutely right. I actually encountered a statistic here, another statistic that the average millennial has a rainy day fund that's able to cover 6 months of living expenses. I thought that was mind blowing that the average 24 to 39-year-old has enough money to cover 6 months of living expenses. And you think about the fact that 63% of millennials have $0 saved for homes. Maybe instead of putting their money into an account meant for a home purchase in the future, they're putting it into an account, a rainy day fund. So to your point, I think millennials have learned from '08. They've learned the importance of having a safety net, and we are certainly savers, despite the kind of meme on the internet that millennials are blowing their money on Saturday brunches and avocado toast. Millennials are actually pretty good with their money, which is encouraging.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
know what isn't that encouraging though? COVID's impact on fertility.
Mm. Tell me more.
Mm. Oh, okay. So I did some research and I came across a professor from the University of Maryland. His name is Philip Cohen, and he started to do some research on finding out, okay, how has U.S. fertility switched during the pandemic? And not every state has information, but some states do. So he found a drop in the birth rate between 5 and 10% across several US states. California, for example, saw a 10% drop in birth rates from December 2020 compared with December 2019, so year over
Wow.
year. In Spain, there was a 23% drop in birth rates, again, over that same time frame. And so I think it's interesting because I, I feel like this trend was already happening pre-pandemic. And
Yeah.
now the question is, how long does it last post-pandemic?
Mm.
And I'm
Yeah.
not sure any of us have the real answer on that. I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think there could be a lot of reasons for that. There could be more focus on careers. There could be the fact that millennials are waiting longer to get married. Millennials are waiting, longer to buy homes and settle down and put their roots in the ground. But that is really interesting that there was such a precipitous decline during the pandemic in a year where life slowed down so much. I would maybe expect some kind of decline, but 10% is staggering.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because eh, there's also news that the microplastics that are in all of our systems is also contributing to a slower fertility rate. So
Oh,
again, I'm not
wow.
putting this, just like, oh, I mean, COVID's impact on fertility is probably not the right thing to say. It's just something that happened during COVID. That might be a better way of phrasing the fertility
Mm,
statistic. Because again, at the end of the day, it's not because of the pandemic. There's like microplastics in our system, there's technology, there's, radiation, whatever you want to say that's leading to the lack of fertility. But, you know, those are the studies around just specifically from 2019 to 2020, some of the drops in rates.
interesting. Yeah, I guess it is hard to say whether it's correlation or causation, but it will be interesting to see what that looks like in terms of its impact on the overall, economic picture going forward. Birth rate is hugely tied to economic growth rate. There need to be more people for the economic pie to continue to grow and for our economy to sustain itself. So I don't know. I'm totally speculating at this point. I don't know if the numbers are that dire yet, but I imagine to keep the economy running as we have it now at 2 or 2.5% GDP, growth in GDP a year, that we'll have to see that birth rate recover in some capacity. And again, dealing with a lot of uncertainties here, that's for sure.
Yeah. So there's birth rates, there's more death that's occurring in our country, there's lower immigration simply because of restrictions and then obviously the pandemic. But when
Yeah.
you put all of that together, the US national 2019 through present 2021 growth rate is only 0.35%.
Wow.
That's the lowest in the last 120 years. So when you look at
Wow.
low immigration, more deaths, and fewer births, our national growth rate of as a population is 0.35%, which is the lowest in the last 120 years.
Wow. Yeah, we need more people. That's fast.
That's crazy,
We're talking about we're talking about overpopulation, and the reality is totally counter to the story. That's amazing.
right?
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, I mean, so I think the 2020 census is going to reveal a lot of this type of information. It very well could show that, we had the smallest, growth rate in America's history. Um, I can also cite a couple of other pieces from the Census Bureau. So just in terms of migration trends, because we've been talking about people moving in and out, but I found this interesting. So U.S. migration trends have shown a fairly consistent decline since the prosperous late 1940s to 1960s, when approximately 1/5 of Americans changed residence annually. By the late 1990s, only about 15 to 16% of the population moved each year. And then in the early 2000s, that was only about 13 or 14%. Migration dropped even further to the 10, 11, and 12% range after the Great Recession. And since 2012, it's actually been dropping. Last year's new low of 9.3% is pretty shocking in terms of the migration trends, because I feel like anyone I've been talking to has talked about moving or has, like moved from the city to the suburbs. But then again, when you look at the numbers, it's like not telling that story.
Yeah, we went all the way from 20% to now less than 10%. People are really staying in place. And going back to the beginning of the conversation, that's actually part of what has limited supply. People aren't moving as much. So there are people that, especially amid COVID, with the health concerns, a lot of people are hunkering down and staying in place. And it seems like they were already staying in place before the pandemic hit. So there's just less churn in the market. That's really interesting. I wonder how that will play out as more millennials age into home buying, and frankly, as baby boomers start to pass on, if there will be some kind of great turnover and change of hands in terms of home ownership.
True. Because the number of people over age 55 grew by 27% between 2010 and 2020.
Wow. That's a lot of people. And you think too about the implications of the wealth transfer. A lot of, I think 1/5 of millennials that have purchased a home have had some help from their parents. So maybe as baby boomers are passing on and providing what inheritance they may have to their children, maybe people will end up buying homes, and it could be later than the historical median average of like 34. Maybe when people are able to have a few $1,000s from their parents, or more than that for their first down payment, maybe we'll see more people buying their first home in their mid 40s. I'm just speculating, but I think the generational wealth transfer might support that.
True. One other thing I wanted to add to this conversation has to do with just the diversity of America moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is absolutely fascinating to me. The fact that if you look at by race, there was a decline of about 16,000 in the nation's white population over 2020 through the end of 2019. And if the full 2020 census comes out and shows this, apparently it's going to show that the 2010 through 2020 decade would be the only decade since the first census was taken in 1790 when the white population did not grow.
Wow.
Yeah, we're talking about a demographic that seems to be stagnating, and that is a major driver of what's going on here in the States. And any gains the white population has had in recent decades, it's grown smaller over time. From 11 million between 1970 and 1980 down to just 2.8 million between 2000 and 2010. But if we actually see a white population loss between 2010 through 2020, that would be something that we have not really experienced.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I'm sure it's partly attributed to white boomers starting to pass away, but maybe there is also a disproportionately low birth rate, going back to your conversation, among white people. So there's less white people, having kids and driving that number back up.
You're super insightful, because those are two big reasons. And then another thing that we're noticing is just simply the age. The median age for white Americans is 44 years old. If you think about that in the context of Latinos or Hispanic Americans, the median age is about 30 years old. The median age for Black Americans is about 35. It's about 37 for Asian Americans. So the ethnically diverse crowd younger. And so to your point, that's all of this is leading to what we're seeing in the demographics here.
That's
And
really
again, all of
fascinating.
that has implications in housing.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. It is a really interesting time. And I think just taking a high level view of the economy, last year we printed a fifth of all the US dollars that have ever been printed. That was in 2020.
What?
You know, yeah, crazy. We're 12 years into a bull market. You know, we're arguably coming to the end of this historically long credit cycle. Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager at Bridgewater Associates, talks a lot about the long-term credit cycle, and he thinks we're at the end of a 70-year cycle that started in World War II. Someone like him would argue that it's not economic activity or economic productivity that has driven up assets like houses, like stocks, like cryptocurrencies since '08. It's actually been credit. So the Fed has kept borrowing at low rates, it's pumped liquidity in the system, and that kind of easy money in someone like Ray Dalio's mind, and he obviously has a point, can only go on for so long. So at some point, the U.S. is going to have to raise rates to make their own debt more attractive. At some point, we'll see this asset inflation across risk assets. And it's important to remember, just like stocks and high yield bonds, homes are risk assets as well. We'll see that asset inflation go the other way, and we'll probably enter a pretty painful period of price discovery where we have to find out what is the true value of these things. What is the true value of Tesla when we're on the backslide of the credit cycle, when we're going the other way, when money isn't easy to borrow, when people aren't borrowing to buy homes or borrowing to buy risk assets, when people are tightening the belt, when we're deep into a bear market, which is, again, something we haven't experienced in 10 years. It'll be super interesting and not just interesting, it'll be I think, pretty intense time for the country, because it feels like we're on the precipice of something, and many Americans are already hurting. We've already gone through this really painful economic transformation for many Americans, and much of the economy is still propped up by artificially low rates and by the unprecedented practices of the Fed. So when the bill comes due, and when we're in a debt cycle rather than a credit cycle, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out across the board, across demographics, across socioeconomic levels, across geographies, what areas are hit harder than others. I think it feels like we've already gone through this big shakeup, and in some sense we have, but the pessimist and the apocalyptic side of me feels like an even larger shakeup could be coming in the next 5 to 10 years, because, again, the long-term credit cycle doesn't go on forever. What comes up must inevitably come down, and I think we're going to see some pretty shocking transformations in the next decade.
Agreed, which is really interesting, because you just talked about how much uncertainty remains and how we're all going to live through it together, and it's all speculation at this point. But in the context of what homeowners are demanding right now, again, going back to like more space and backyards, it's just going to be interesting to see, how relevant that was.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's definitely an aspiration of mine to one point have a home, and hopefully I'll have a workspace and a backyard, and it all sounds pretty good to me. I've been renting for the last 10 years. I've been sharing walls with strangers, and I would love to at some point have my walls all to myself, but we shall see what happens.
Yeah, totally. Well, again, Jay, I appreciate the conversation. And in terms of just, the biggest takeaways, I think it's the fact that we're in a frenzy right now. People are demanding things. The market is reacting. But quite frankly, the impact on how we work, where we live, how many kids we have, it's all about to play out.
Yeah, we're going to watch it happen. It was great talking with you, Arjun.
See ya.
Peace.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglaterally.com.
Thank you.